All right, we've talked about the Spanish. Now let's talk about the French in the New World. One of the big three, I guess you could say, when it came to colonial powers in North America: Spain, France, and England. Well, the French did not really do a whole lot in the 1500s. There were no successful settlements in North America by France. But by the very early 1600s, there was a foothold by the French in this area called Acadia, and you can see it there just below Louisbourg, just to the right of the red English colonies. So Acadia, in the early 1600s, as a result of one of the many, many wars between the English and the French, the Acadians, the French in Acadia, found themselves occupied by the British, who took over that island and essentially kicked all the French people out, kicked them out. So they had to go someplace that was a French settlement that was safe from the British. So most of those Acadians left and went all the way down to New Orleans, which is at the mouth of the Mississippi, down there in the Gulf of Mexico. So the English name for those people is Acadians, from Acadia, but the French name for the place is Acadie, and the French name for the people is Acadiens. Acadien from Acadie. So Acadien, Cajun, that's where the term Cajun comes from. The ancestors of Cajuns were French Canadians who were kicked out of Acadia up there in Canada and made their way down to New Orleans. Well, some of the noteworthy early French explorers included Samuel de Champlain, or Samuel Champlain, if you want to get all American about it, who in 1608 founded the city of Quebec. Now, again, this is French stuff, so it's not pronounced Quebec in French, it is Quebec. Now, if you put a K on the end of it, it's Quebec, and that's over in White County, just a few miles from here. But the Canadian city and province is Quebec, founded by Samuel de Champlain. 1673, two explorers, a Catholic priest named Jacques Marquette and a fur trader named Louis Joliet led an expedition down, and you can see some on the map here. They'd started up in Canada, and they went southward and came upon the Mississippi River. So they are credited for discovering the Mississippi River, although lots and lots and lots of people knew about it. None of them were European, though. They were Native American. And that was 1673. A few years after that, 1681, René Robert de Chevalier Sieur de la Salle, or Robert de la Salle, led an expedition that traveled down the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, thereby finding the mouth of the river, and claimed the entire Mississippi River and the entire Mississippi River Valley, which is along both sides of the river, for France. So that's how we wound up with this map, which this is circa 1700s, like 1750 or so. So the English by that time, we haven't even got to them yet, but I bet you were aware there's going to be English colonies down the Atlantic coast. In fact, I bet you're aware there's going to be 13 of them in all. You can see by comparison of how much territory is taken up, the English had only a fraction of the territory in the New World that France did. France had a large, just a huge area known as New France, or in French, Nouvelle France. And Nouvelle France was divided into two districts: Canada, which is the upper right, and then Louisiane, which is all along the Mississippi River, that area down through there. Well, the French have way more territory, but it turns out that the English are going to have way, way more people. And that's because, primary reason, although there are many secondary reasons, but the primary reason for England establishing colonies was because they wanted land for people to leave England and go live on and settle and colonize. That was not the goal of the French in the New World. Now, they did establish some forts and they established some cities, but not anywhere near as many as the English did. In fact, there were far fewer French people than English people, far fewer, in North America. So the French approach was very few settlers. They did not send missionaries along to forcibly convert the native people to Christianity, which Spain had done and England would attempt to do. They didn't try to interfere with native culture. You just go ahead and live how you like. They didn't try to forcibly convert them. All this is because the French had a different goal in mind than the Spanish and later the English, because the Spanish they basically wanted mineral resources. Spanish were looking for gold and silver primarily. And then they were looking for labor, cheap labor, to extract that gold and silver. The English were looking for land. What were the French after? The French were after trade with the Indians. And that trade, it might include, for example, timber, but the really big thing was the fur trade. They wanted to get furs, which were bountiful in the New World and prized back in Europe for making clothing and so forth. They wanted to get that from the Indians. Therefore, the French were a lot nicer to the Indians. Now, is that because French are just basically nicer than English or Spanish people? No, because in other parts of the world, even other parts of the Western Hemisphere, where the French held sway, in areas where they had different goals, like in the Caribbean, in their colonies like Martinique, and and what would later be known as Haiti, their goal was to produce as much sugar as it was possible to produce, and they were every bit as vicious to the native peoples as any other colonial power. But they were not as vicious toward them in North America, because they weren't trying to take their land away. They weren't trying to remove them. They were just trying to trade with them. So therefore, it was in the best interests of the French not to interfere with the Indians, not to make the Indians angry. Instead of the approach that most English people would later take, which is trying to force the Indians to act like English people, the French were a lot more likely, those merchants and traders who were living among the Indians, much more likely to just make a change themselves to be more like Indians in their lifestyle. Now, for this reason, later on, you're going to find that when England and France go to war against each other, which they're doing constantly, the largest number of Native American tribes tend to side with the French. A few side with the English, but most are always on the side of the French, because the French were a lot easier to deal with. They're not there to remove you and take your land. All right, so that's some important stuff about the French. Let's take a look at some of the other sort of secondary players before we move on to England. For example, the Dutch. The Dutch established a colony in North America in 1624 that they called New Netherland, the capital of which was a city they called New Amsterdam. And you can see that swath there in New York and New Jersey of that purplish area. That's the area that was settled by the Dutch. About 40 years later, the English chased them out and took it away from them and renamed New Amsterdam New York, and renamed the whole colony. In fact, New York made it an English colony. And that's why there's a strong Dutch influence in New York and New Jersey, which may not jump right out at you, but if you've been in New York City, some of the place names, some of the street names, certainly are not English. In fact, one of the 5 boroughs, the Bronx, that's a Dutch word. Families who were of Dutch descent who stayed on after the English took over had a big influence on New York culture later. Like, for example, the Roosevelt family. Roosevelt is a Dutch name. They were old money, and by old, I mean their money was actually older than New York. Martin Van Buren, U.S. president, was from a family descended from the Dutch. He was born a couple of hundred years later, but he himself didn't learn to speak English until he started school. He spoke Dutch as his native language. In fact, I'm going to throw this out here. It's not really relevant to anything, but it's a fun fact to know. Have you ever heard the word poppycock? Well, maybe not unless you watch old movies, but I used to hear it a lot. It meant basically BS, and it was usually some upper class rich person who was using this term. What a load of poppycock! And I really would have associated it with the aristocracy of England, but I discovered it's actually a New York word. And having realized that, I go back and look at those old movies. It's often rich folks from the New York area who are saying poppycock. Poppycock comes from a Dutch term. I think it's pronounced pupikaka, which means just what it sounds like it means. It means like really thin, runny diarrhea. So if you're spewing something that is worthless or makes no sense, it's so much poppycock. So that's not going to be on the test, but you are now burdened with that knowledge, because if I am, you should be too. Also, the Swedes briefly had a foothold in the Americas. 1638, they established New Sweden, and or Nya Svenga, which you can see just this tiny light purplish area there, right along the borders of Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So like the Dutch, they were chased out, and that was taken over by the English. And finally, before we go to the other member of the big 3, England, let's take a look at one more European group that colonized the Americas, one that most people don't think of, in large part because they didn't attempt to colonize it from the Atlantic Ocean. They came across the Pacific Ocean. That is, the Russians, who in 1648 discovered Alaska. Well, native people had discovered Alaska 20,000 years before that, but Russians did. At first, for the first century or so, they didn't do much with it except send missionaries, Russian Eastern Orthodox missionaries trying to convert the Inuits. But by the 1740s, they started to establish colonies in Alaska and then down the Pacific coast of North America. In fact, all the way down into northern California by the early 1800s. And those settlements, those establishments, also not settler colonialism. They weren't trying to, find a place to export huge numbers of Russians. They wanted in on the fur trade, just as the French did over on the other coast. And so that they had relationships with the native tribes who provided them with beaver, also with otter pelts. Until the early 1840s, the Russians decided that their settlement way far to the south in northern California was kind of worthless, so they just let Mexico have that. And shortly afterward, the U.S. took it away from Mexico, and within a few months found gold there. The Russians held on to Alaska for about another quarter of a century, at which point they decided it was pretty worthless, so they sold it to the United States in the 1860s, and about 20 years later, the U.S. found gold there. So Russia has a very bad track record of utilizing the resources of their colonies in North America. All right, well, we will speak very little about the Dutch moving forward. and probably nothing at all about the Swedes or the Russians, other than the fact that there at the beginning, at the ground floor, they were among the many European powers who were trying to take advantage of the opportunities of exploration and colonization in the New World. And that, finally, brings us to England. Let's talk a little bit about why it is that England, in particular, was so absorbed, so focused on gaining land, particularly in comparison to other European colonial powers. Well, I think I said before that there was a population issue, particularly in England. And really, it wasn't so much a matter of overpopulation as it was a matter of moving population, of overcrowding in the cities, as huge numbers of formerly rural people, former peasants from the countryside, were moving into the larger cities, making them larger still. And all this is tied in to the transition in England from feudalism to what's called proto-capitalism, early form of capitalism. So feudalism, I'm sure you're familiar with the term, is the system that was in place in the Middle Ages, in medieval Europe. Under feudalism, you have a series of different relationships that are supposed to be reciprocal, in which each layer, here we have a pyramid, each layer owes certain obligations to the ones above them and has certain duties to the ones below them. At the top of the pyramid is the monarch, usually a king, sometimes a queen. So there are lords, the nobility, under the monarch. And those lords have to swear fealty or loyalty to the king, and they are required to provide the king with his army, with military aid as he calls for it. Now their responsibilities are to those under them, the knights. That's the next lowest level. The knights are fed by the they're paid, given food, protection, and shelter by the lords, and in return they have loyalty to them. They pay them homage, and they provide them with military service. Under the knights, you had the peasants, called serfs, in places like Russia, where serfs had fewer rights even than peasants did. But essentially, the peasants were the people who lived on the land, who worked the land, and they also owed loyalty to the knights, and the knights technically were in control over that land. Each knight had a certain amount of land, and then all the knights who were grouped under a certain lord, why really then all that land ultimately was owed to that lord, and then from the lord to the king, and so forth. So the peasants who lived in villages farmed the land that the knights controlled, and they gave part of the produce as rent to the knights, and in return, the knights provided them with shelter, food, protection, and so forth. The peasants also owed military service to the knights. So, if there is a war, if the King of England goes to war with the King of France, then the King of England calls on all the lords. They have to come up with armies, each of their own, to provide the king. Those armies are made up of a bunch of knights, but each of those knights is going to provide a bunch of peasant soldiers, foot soldiers. They're not allowed to ride horses. The word for knight in French and Italian comes from the word for horse. So the knights were usually mounted. And then you've got just pikemen, long spears and stuff, sticks sometimes, pitchforks. Definitely not the type of armor that the knights had, which the peasants couldn't afford. So there's this kind of chain through which things travel. And end result is, of course, king sitting there at the top gets the most benefit. But everything depended on control of the land and what was produced agriculturally on the land, which is why, in the House of Lords, for example, the upper house of Parliament, those titles, the titles the nobility have, which were hereditary, a membership in the House of Lords was hereditary for a very long time, all depends on how much land is attached to that title, what you are the Duke of, or the Earl of, or on the mainland in other European countries, Baron of. And on this land, on the land that was presided over by a particular noble or a knight, then you would have on that land you'd have a lot of farmland, but you would also have, if you'll notice here on this map, in the upper right in green, the common pasture. Now, these other things are pastures, the spring planting, the autumn planting, and so forth. That's to produce the stuff that goes up to the knights and to the lords and becomes essentially translated into wealth, because it can be traded in addition to just sitting around being perishable foodstuffs. But the green area, the common pasture, that's where everyone that lives in the village goes and works, in addition to doing their work for the nobility, growing stuff that they can eat. And then you also have the woodland north of that in this map. The woodlands also were part of the commons. So the woods that were maintained in these domains was for both the lord himself. You see there's another patch of woodland down here on the lower left. But, the lord can go hunting there, but also the peasants can hunt there to get small game to supplement meat, to supplement the vegetables that they're growing. And that's how it all worked. But things started to change. Now, there were a couple of reasons things started to change. One was the opening up of new sea routes that led to new opportunities for trade for more distant lands. Another thing was, of course, the plague. The Black Death killed a bunch of people. That made it kind of hard to have enough manpower to do all the farming there for a long time. And the transition to capitalism, away from feudalism, capitalism meaning that a person who has wealth, sufficient wealth, would invest that wealth in ventures, business ventures that might be agricultural, might be trade, might be industrial, or whatever. And so they invest in that, and that's where their further wealth comes from. Now, what happens here is the peasants get cut out, because as in England particularly, as the nobility and the people with the wealth were looking for ways to expand their wealth in this atmosphere of new trade but declining population, wool became very important. Particularly, there was a big market for wool on the European mainland. So that was a way to make pretty much guaranteed money. Prices for wool also were going up. So what a lot of the nobility did was they fenced off the commons. They fenced off their lands, and did not allow the villagers access to that land to do their farming. And they also cut down a bunch of the trees in the woodlands to make that pasture land to raise sheep. And so the farmers weren't able to hunt game there. And eventually it reached the point that, the farmers are kind of getting in the way. The peasants are sort of getting in the way. So the nobility had many of the villages just torn down. Tore down the villages that was on their land, technically. And that left all those peasants unemployed and now homeless. So they didn't have a lot of options without being able to work the land, because they didn't own any land themselves, and there was no way for them to get land, because you have to have money to buy land, and they didn't have money. So they could be beggars, which could lead to serious problems. You could be arrested and thrown into the workhouse, the poorhouse, or they could go into the cities and try to find work, as there was more and more industrial things becoming available. Now, the Industrial Revolution hadn't started yet. It was almost 175 years away. But there was still a growing amount of industry along the coast of England. Cities that were port cities started to grow because of all the trade that's now going on globally. So maybe you could get a job in one of these manufacturing centers, but you probably couldn't, because there were too many people competing for those jobs. So you can't find a job. You don't have a home. If you don't have a job or a home, you're going to get thrown in jail. Something has to be done. Now, over the course of the 1500s, there had been several peasant rebellions, basically rising up and trying to overthrow the status quo to try to secure some rights for themselves. And that's problematic for those who are in charge, because that's a big chance of the status quo being disrupted. If the status quo is disrupted, your life and your wealth are disrupted. So you've got this huge growing class of poor people in the cities with very little to do, getting more and more frustrated, more and more angry. There has to be some kind of outlet for them. There's got to be some place to send them. And that is where colonization came in. Finding a solution to the problem of all of those urban poor, which had been, as a class, basically created by the enclosure system, was one of the biggest factors in England beginning in the 1500s to spread out and try to establish colonies in the New World. That's one thing. Another thing is that England was at war with Spain, and Spain had come a long way since Christopher Columbus in the previous almost century, because they controlled so much of the Western Hemisphere, including all that gold and silver. That gave them an enormous amount of wealth and enabled them to fund a very powerful navy and army. So there was a lot of tension between those two countries. The Spanish, by the way, in 1588, made that famous attempt to launch an armada across the English Channel to actually invade England, which was successfully repulsed. That's 1588. They were getting all that gold and silver from the New World, and it was coming through the Spanish ports in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So that's another factor in the English trying to get some colonies, to be able to have something close by so that they could intercept that Spanish shipping, but not so close that the Spanish would find them. The first really big effort was in 1587, 1 year before the Spanish Armada, when a company was chartered to establish a colony along the Atlantic coast of North America, and they established that colony on Roanoke Island, just off the shore of North Carolina. There was among other people, there was a couple named Dare, Dare, who had a little daughter. The mother gave birth to a little daughter whom they named Virginia, which was the name that was being applied to this whole region by the English, because that was in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as the Virgin Queen. So little Virginia Dare was the first person of English descent to be born in the Americas. And you probably know, you've probably heard of Roanoke and what happened there. The leader of the colony went back across the Atlantic to England to get supplies, to resupply the colony, and kind of got stuck due to that war with Spain and some bad weather. It took him a year or so to get back to Roanoke, and when he did, he found that all 114 colonists were gone. There was no sign of any struggle. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved in the side of a tree. And Croatoan was the name of a nearby tribe of Indians. So that has been a great mystery that has never been solved, unless you're a Stephen King fan, in which case you know that the colonists at Roanoke sold their souls to the devil, and then he forced them to march out into the ocean and drown themselves. Spoiler alert. Or perhaps you are an adherent to the American Horror Story historical school of thought, and you will know that what happened in Roanoke was not so much due directly to Satan as to a witch played by Lady Gaga and a psychopathic lady colonist played by Kathy Bates. But all that is beside the point. I digress. Point is, they were all gone, so you can't really call that a successful colony. Odds are, and historians have been speculating this for years, in recent years there have been a couple of different finds that lend credence to this idea. Essentially, the most likely scenario is that the colonists, not having been resupplied for so long and not able to fend for themselves, left the island, went to the mainland toward the friendly tribe of Croatoan Indians, and perhaps pushed ever further inland and intermarried among the native peoples, and over time just were sort of absorbed into the overall population of the local tribes. So that was 1587. It was 20 years later before the really successful colony, the one that stuck, was established in Jamestown. And there is a drawing of the early colony of Jamestown, the city, that was permitted to be built on some very marshy waters by the local Indians. And by the way, that is Captain John Smith up there, leader of this expedition. The local Indians in question were the Powhatan, or Powhatan as they've sometimes been pronounced, the Powhatan Confederacy, and their leader was called Powhatan by the colonists. His name was actually Wahun Seneca. He had a daughter named Pocahontas and a younger brother named Opechancanough, both of whom we will be discussing more later. So here is a map of the area as attributed to the various tribes who dominated in those regions. And 1583, the first kind of sort of English colony up in Newfoundland, St. John's. It was really little more than a fishing camp. It would be 50 years before an actual town would be built there. So that one kind of counts, but it kind of doesn't. Then this is the location in 1587 of Roanoke, and finally in 1607 of Jamestown. In 1606, the British Crown had granted charters to two companies, giving them permission to establish settlements in on the coast of North America. The London Company and the Plymouth Company. The London Company was supplanted not long afterward, renamed the Virginia Company. So the Virginia Company has permission all the way in that red area you see there. The Plymouth Company would have permission, and it would be about 15 years before they took advantage of it in the northern area. And then there's a spot where they overlap, and that area was open to either of them, but neither could build a settlement within 100 miles of the other company's settlement. So these are companies, these are joint stock companies. Individual investors gave their money, gave their capital as an investment to start these colonies up. So there's two things, actually there's three things going on at once with this settlement. Now, one of the things is that in the 1580s, when they first started trying to establish these colonies, there was a big concern about war with Spain, which in fact was right around the corner at that time, and a desire to have a supply base for British ships, for English ships, that could raid Spanish merchant ships coming out of the Caribbean without being too close to the Caribbean so the Spanish could find them. So that was one thing. Another thing was an opportunity for investors to make money, because that's what this colony was all about, an effort to find gold or silver or find some kind of crop that would be lucrative for the people who had invested their money in the company. And then the third thing was that it was a destination to which some of those poor people could be spent and could be useful. Now, in efforts to get people to join in on this colonial project, especially after the first one had failed, there were broadsides, basically posters printed up and distributed in London and other cities trying to get people to join up for this venture to go to Nova Britannia, or New England, and the colony of Virginia, which wasn't actually, settled yet, but they named it already. And Captain John Smith said that in this new colony, every man may be the master and owner of his own labor and land. And that was a very enticing opportunity to own your own land, because, like we talked about, very few opportunities to do that in England, and to own your own labor. You see, many poor people who hadn't been able to find a job had been forced to indenture themselves. So if you were an employer, having an indentured servant was a better investment than having to pay someone wages indefinitely. So basically, when you indentured yourself, you were selling your labor for a period of, depending on the contract, 5 to 7 years, sometimes 8 years. And in essence, you were selling yourself. You were putting yourself completely at the mercy of whoever had the other side of this contract. Now, a lot of people signed these things in order to get across the ocean to that colony, because the promise was made, if you get there, you can claim your own land. That's if you got the money to get there. If you don't have the money to get there, but you still want to have a shot at it, why, then you go over as an indentured servant, accompanying someone, and oftentimes accompanying someone hired by by a richer someone, to be their servants and to give them your labor, right? Now, about 2/3 of the early colonists to Virginia came over this way, including my first ancestor to the New World. So that was a nice promise that if you could get, once you got to the end of your contract, however many years it was, 7 was the most common, then you were free and you owned your own labor and you could claim your own land. Well, that's a nice promise, but it didn't usually work out just like that, at least for the first half century or so. Because for one thing, most of those indentured servants didn't live 7 years for various reasons. Starvation, for one thing, in the early years in Jamestown. Conflicts with the local Native American Indians was another issue. Disease, particularly since Jamestown was basically built in a swamp. And then if you did manage to get to the end of your 7 years and get your freedom, well, guess what? All the people who had come over with money had already claimed all the land. All the best land at first, and then all the usable land. And so you were kind of pushed out on the frontier where you were going to have to contend with hostile Native Americans to be able to claim any land at all. And beginning in 1619, there was also the use of African slaves for the first time in Jamestown. So that's the kind of people that wound up in this first colony, which was in what would later be the American South in Virginia. So you had either middling well-to-do people who came over because they could afford to come over to claim land, much of the land and the produce of which was expected that it would go back to the company that had made the investment, which would go back to the people who owned basically the stock in the company. And those poor people who came over as indentured servants, hoping that they would be able to make a life for themselves and get ahead once they had made it through their years of indenture. And then later, of course, people from Africa who had been forcibly removed from there and forced into slavery. And then over time, they also started using local Native American people as slaves who had been captured in the various wars that broke out. So that's what was going on beginning in 1607 in Virginia. The first major war between native tribes and English colonists happened in the first successful English colony of Jamestown. And we're talking about, by when I say the major war, 1622, there were some smaller conflicts, smaller war that lasted from 1610 to 1614. Didn't have nearly as many casualties as this later war did because there weren't that many English colonists there at that time. That was early on. By 1614, that war was ended and peace sort of reigned for the next several years. But several things changed after that. 1617, Pocahontas died of smallpox while she was on a trip to England with her husband John Rolfe and several other Powhatan Indians. Following year, her father, Wahun Seneca, also known as Powhatan, died. 1619, the first African slaves were brought to the Jamestown colony. Also around 1619, there was a big infusion of new immigrants to the colony. Tobacco was becoming established as a profitable crop, and that was bringing more people. 1621, a ship with 57 single women came to town. who had been sent for by the male colonists hoping to start families, and they set about doing just that, So the population was steadily growing, so that by 1622 there were over 1,200 English settlers, not just in the town of Jamestown, but several other smaller settlements that had spread out from there. Now, the guy in charge with the death of Seneca or Powhatan was his younger brother, Opechancanough, who had never really been very trusting of these English colonists from the beginning, and had sort of warned against letting them get a foothold. His older brother, though, had wanted to interact with the English colonists to have trade and to get leverage so as to grow the influence of the Powhatan Confederacy. So anyway, that was starting to look like it had been a mistake with all these people showing up. So Opechancanough planned a strike against them. Now, for a long time, this was known as the Uprising of 1622 in history books. I put that in quotation marks, and historians don't really use that term anymore because it's not entirely appropriate, because the word uprising implies that it is a group of dominated people in an inferior position rebelling against people with rightful authority over them, or at least with authority over them, and that's not the case. That's certainly not how the Powhatan Confederacy members looked at it. They had watched the number of these colonists slowly start to grow, decided to nip it in the bud. It was more of a preemptive strike. Now, it was a surprise attack. It was not unusual for Indians to be in Jamestown and the other settlements, trading and for various other reasons. So Opechancanough led a large number of Powhatan men into Jamestown, and then gave a signal. They were unarmed. Gave a signal, and they just grabbed whatever was handy at first and started attacking colonists and killing them, and then taking their weapons. And it sort of rapidly grew from there, and resulted in, within a short time, about 1/3 of all the English colonists in the Virginia colony had been killed, including probably a lot of those newly arrived new wives, sadly. Sadly, it was sad for anyone to get killed, right? Women, children, old people, it didn't matter. This was obviously a traumatic event for the survivors among the colonists, but it was also kind of a moment of marking identity, because what happened is that all of them weren't killed. Actually, if Opechancanough had pressed harder, he probably could have killed all of them, but that's not generally how Indians in the region operated when it came to warfare. This was probably more to strike a really big blow to kind of put these new people in their place, let them know who's boss, that it's not them, figuring they would learn from that. But what happened instead was that the survivors rallied together, and of course there were more immigrants that started to come in, and those surviving colonists and the new arrivals were able to not only rally, but press a counterattack. Now, this war lasted for 10 years. So this is not something that happened overnight, not like the initial attack. And the tactics, the strategy really, that the colonists used was, instead of directly attacking the numerically superior Powhatans, they burned their crops. Burned them or just took them, and slowly starved out their attackers. So finally, after a decade, peace was declared. Opechancanough was not captured or deposed. He remained in charge, but as a result of the decade of fighting and of starving, the Powhatan lost their influence in the region. And so the balance of power shifted. Previously, before the arrival of the English, the balance of power was something that was maintained among the different Indian tribes. Now, for the first time, the balance of power tilts toward the English. And they're going to take advantage of that. And over the ensuing decades, they are going to infringe more and more on not just the Powhatan, but all the other surrounding tribes. Here's an image of those first mail-order brides on the frontier, which would be the sort of thing that would still that would continue to be done all the way up into the 1870s and 1880s as the westward expansion continued. Anyway, I mentioned this was a sort of a moment that marked identification for the colonists, and indeed it was. You see, the colonists, who were English citizens, as a result of this very brutal war, in which initially a third of them were killed, began to think of themselves not just as English citizens. They began to think of themselves as different from other English citizens. Obviously, they were colonists. That's what they were doing. But they started to. This was really the beginning of this identity of the new colony and the new land. Perhaps one could even say identifying themselves as American, because they had endured something. They had survived something that people living back in London, or even in some of the other colonies that the English had established around the world, had not experienced this particular thing. It kind of marked them as unique and different, and gave them sort of a community identity. Again, not separate from, but in addition to the crown. The separate from, of course, will come later.